Theology does not usually die from a lack of sincerity. It dies from confusion. It dies when people mistake repetition for understanding, piety for intelligence, slogans for judgment, and borrowed certainty for truth. And that is where Bernard Lonergan begins. He begins with a simple but severe question. What is method actually for? Not in chemistry alone, not in physics alone, not in biblical studies alone, but in theology. Because if theology is going to do more than repeat inherited formulas, if it's going to speak truthfully into history, into culture, into crisis, then it has to know what it is doing when it knows, when it judges, and when it chooses. And that is why method in theology matters. Not because it gives us a technique, because it asks what kind of consciousness is required for theological work at all. Welcome to this series on Bernard Lonergan's method in theology. This first episode is about the stakes. Before we get to doctrine, systematics, history, interpretation, or communications, we have to understand why Lonergan thinks theology needs method in the first place. And his opening move is already decisive. He says, theology mediates between a cultural matrix and the significance and role of a religion within that matrix. That is easy to pass over, but it contains the whole problem. Because once you say that theology mediates between religion and culture, then theology cannot be imagined as something frozen outside history. It is not an artifact in a museum. It is not a sealed container of propositions untouched by time. It is an ongoing work of mediation. And that means that when culture changes, theology cannot simply pretend nothing has happened. Lonergan sharpens the point by contrasting two notions of culture. There is the older classicist notion, where culture is treated as if there were one permanent normative form to which everyone ought to conform. And then there is the empirical notion of culture, where culture is understood as a living set of meanings and values informing a way of life, something that can develop slowly or dissolve rapidly. If you hold the first view, theology will look like a finished achievement, and the main question becomes its nature. If you hold the second, theology appears as an ongoing process, and the main question becomes its method. That is the turn. That is why this book is called Method in Theology and not simply Theology. Now, Lonergan immediately clears away one misunderstanding. Method is not a set of rules to be followed mechanically. And this is memorable because method is not rules for adult. Method, rather, is a framework for collaborative creativity. That is one of the most important lines in his entire book because it means method is not meant to replace intelligence. It is meant to discipline intelligence. It does not save us from thinking. It orders our thinking so that inquiry can become cumulative instead of chaotic, and shared labor can advance instead of collapsing into repetition, rivalry, and confusion. From there, Lonergan announces right at the start the 8 great tasks of theology: research, interpretation, history, dialectic, foundations, doctrines, systematics, and communications. Those 8 will guide the whole series. But in this episode, I want to emphasize something prior. Lonergan does not begin with those specialties. He begins deeper. He begins with the structure of human knowing and choosing itself. And that tells you what kind of project this is. He is not primarily or merely reorganizing a theology department. He's asking what operations theologians perform when they actually do theology. So chapter 1 opens with a diagnosis. Thought, about method, he says, usually runs in one of three channels. The first treats method as an art learned by apprenticeship. You learn from the master, you imitate the performance, you receive correction. And there is truth in that. The second takes the most successful science of the age, studies its procedures, then tries to impose that model everywhere else. That too has been immensely influential. But Lonergan thinks both approaches are insufficient for theology. Apprenticeship alone cannot rescue a weak field because weak fields lack unquestioned masters. And imitation of the dominant science does not really help theology either because it simply demotes anything that does not look like physics. So he proposes what he calls a third way, not imitation, not mere custom, but reflection on the operations of the human mind itself. And that move is crucial. Lonergan does not start from theology's objects. He starts from the subject who is doing the knowing, and that leads him to his famous preliminary definition. He says, a method is a normative pattern of recurrent and related operations yielding cumulative and progressive results. That definition is dense, so let's try to slow it down. A method has operations. Those operations recur. They are related. Their relations form a pattern. That pattern is normative, meaning it is the right way to do the job. And when that pattern is followed well, the result is not mere repetition, but cumulative and progressive advance. So, to make that concrete, Lonergan turns first to natural science. Science inquires, it observes, it describes, it discovers, it formulates hypotheses, it deduces implications, it devises experiments, it tests. These are distinct operations, but they are not a heap. They form an ordered pattern. Inquiry sharpens experience into observation. Observation is pinned down by description. Conflicting descriptions generate problems. Problems provoke discoveries. Discoveries are formulated as hypotheses. Hypotheses generate deductions. Deductions lead to experiments. Experiments produce fresh data. And so, as Lonergan says is in one of his best images, the wheel of method not only turns, it rolls along. That is what cumulative and progressive means. But then he makes an equally important clarification. Method is not primarily a recipe. It is not a set of fixed prescriptions that can guarantee discovery, because discovery and synthesis do not arrive on command. They can be made more likely. They cannot be mechanically produced. And that matters enormously for theology, because theology is often tempted by two opposite errors. On the one side, a false spontaneity where everyone says whatever seems profound at the moment, and on the other, a false proceduralism where people act as if truth can be generated simply by following a checklist. Lonergan rejects both. Real knowing is structured but alive, normative but not mechanical, disciplined but not dead. From here, he makes the decisive turn. If method cannot finally be grounded in recipes, then where is it grounded? His answer is startlingly simple. In the conscious and intentional operations of the human subject. And then he even gives us a long list. Seeing, hearing, touching, imagining, inquiring, understanding, conceiving, formulating, reflecting, weighing evidence, judging, deliberating, evaluating, deciding, speaking, writing. This is not random. It is an attempt to make us notice what we are actually doing when we come to know an act. And here Lonergan demands something from the reader. You cannot get this secondhand. You cannot just memorize the terms and move on. You have to recognize these operations in your own performance. You have to discover in your own consciousness the movement from one operation to the next. Otherwise, he says the whole book will be about as illuminating as a lecture on color to a blind man. And this is vintage Lonergan. He is telling you that method begins in self-appropriation, and that is not narcissistic introspection, not privileged feelings, but rigorous attention to the actual structure of human cognitional and moral activity. So, what structure does he find? 4 levels. First, the empirical level. Here we sense, perceive, imagine, and feel. Second, the intellectual level. Here we inquire, understand, formulate. Third, the rational level. Here we reflect, weigh evidence, judge whether something is really so. And fourth, the responsible level. Here we deliberate, evaluate, decide, and act. This is the heart of the episode because now we can state the path very simply. Data, understanding, truth, value. Or, more exactly, from experience to understanding, from understanding to judgment, from judgment to decision. This is the inner drama of responsible consciousness, and theology, if it is real theology, has to move along that path. It cannot stop at data without seeking intelligibility. It cannot stop at insights without asking whether they are true. It cannot stop at truth without asking what is good and what must be done. This is why method matters. Because theology is not exhausted by collecting text, producing interpretations, or even making true statements. It is part of a larger movement of consciousness ordered towards responsible judgment and action. Lonergan then introduces one of his great terms because of this transcendental method. What is it? What is transcendental method? It is the basic pattern of operations considered in its unrestricted character. It is transcendental because it is not limited to one field, one subject matter, one discipline. It concerns any inquiry whatsoever because it concerns the human mind itself and its drive towards intelligibility, truth, reality, and value. Other methods belong to particular fields. Transcendental method belongs to the subject as knower and agent. Now that can sound abstract, but Lonergan makes it concrete immediately. In one sense, everyone already uses transcendental method. Whenever you are attentive, intelligent, reasonable, and responsible, you are already operating by it. But in another sense, very few people are truly at home in it, because to become at home in it, you have to heighten consciousness by objectifying it. You have to know what you are doing when you know. You have to know why that counts as knowing. You have to know what follows when you decide badly or responsibly. That is why Lonergan insists that his first chapter is not offering merely a theory among theories. He thinks it names something you can find in yourself as the dynamic structure of your own cognitional and moral being. And because that structure is what makes revision possible, it cannot simply be revised away. Any revision already presupposes experience, understanding, judgment, and decision. So the pattern cannot be denied without being used in the very act of denial. That is why he says there is a rock on which one can build, not a formula, not a school, not a system. The rock is the subject in attentive, intelligent, reasonable, responsible consciousness. That point has immense consequences. It means theology is not saved by louder assertions. It is not secured by institutional prestige alone. It is not guaranteed by multiplying citations. Theology becomes intelligent and trustworthy insofar as the theologian is operating authentically. This is why transcendental method eventually unfolds into simple but demanding precepts. Be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, be responsible. Those are not decorative slogans, they are the condensed form of the entire structure. And every special theological method is in some way a specification of those precepts. So now we can see why the 8 functional specialities are not arbitrary. They arise because theology is complex, because consciousness has distinct levels, and because different tasks require different organized sets of operations. Research seeks the data. Interpretation seeks understanding. History judges what was going forward. Dialectic sorts conflict. Then, in the second phase, foundations names the horizon from which theology proceeds. Doctrines formulates what is to be affirmed. Systematic seeks understanding of what is affirmed, then communications brings it effectively to people and cultures. In this first episode, though, the main point is much simpler. Before theology can divide into specialties, it must understand the movement of consciousness that makes any specialty possible. This is why Lonergan begins there. He is not delaying theology, he is clearing the ground so that theology does not become blind, mechanical, or self-deceived. So, let me end with the question that should stay with us. Why does method matter? Because without method, theology either imitates other disciplines badly or retreats into repetition. Because without method, data piles up without understanding, insights multiply without judgment, judgments harden without responsibility. Because without method, theology can become brilliant and yet unserious, devout and yet confused, active and yet unintelligent. Lonergan wants something better. He wants a theology that knows what it is doing, a theology adequate to history, adequate to culture, adequate to truth, adequate to the good. And the beginning of that task is not exotic. It begins when we notice the operations by which we actually move from experience to understanding, from understanding to truth, and from truth to responsible action. In the next episode, we move from method in general to the human good, because once consciousness is understood as structured and self-transcending, the next question becomes unavoidable. What, in fact, is the good that our judging and choosing are for?